Welcome to the Enneagram with Chelsea and Nicole. This is a positively deviant culture podcast anchored in the Enneagram. And today we're picking back up where we left off, still talking about the type 6. Today we're really excited to explore the 6 around us. So thinking about the 6s in our lives and our workplaces and how we can leverage their strengths and lean into them, as well as the 6 within us. So knowing that we can embody all 9 types and that the Enneagram as this transformation tool is designed to help us integrate into more of the wonderful attributes of each type versus staying fixed in our default type. We're going to explore both aspects of that. Nicole, what would you say is your goal in this conversation?
The goal kind of remains the same in every conversation, which is just to engage, a dialogue and kind of discover what we have experienced and to evolve our own understanding, really, of ourselves and of the people around us. And I think that it's an ongoing process, and it's something that's very much interpretive. And, I don't think there's too many authorities on what all of this is and means, right? So my goal is to continue my learning and development and to discover new insights or to refine existing insights, right? And so I think we need each other to do that. And I just don't mean you and me, but I mean all of us, right? We come together in the human experience and try to help each other out.
Yeah. Something we've also talked about is how you can't necessarily experience the Enneagram by reading a book, right? It's like hopping into a swimming pool and swimming in the deep end. You need partners, you need collaboration. We've also talked a lot about the nuance and how the Enneagram comes to life as you start thinking about context. And so I'm going to kick us off with a couple experiences that I have from 6s that I've worked with. And this is going to highlight some of the attributes that we've talked about in terms of 6ness, and also start to unpack the ways that they're contributing to the benefit of, I guess, human beings and our world. And so one 6 I worked really, really closely with, and we, to this day, have a really great friendship. The way I would describe her is fearlessly, not even advocating, it's stronger than that. Really, with so much tenacity, having her team's back. Almost from that like protection, defending, guardianship. And this was such a beautiful thing to see as I would hear her, in conversations thinking about standing up for what would be good for her team, advocating in some ways that they should be protected. And in maybe some ways too, feeling her own anxieties about, potential impacts to her team, and wanting to stand in the way of that.
Yeah, I love this, Chelsea. I mean, it's often difficult to engage these conversations because, there's a little bit of an 8 in there and, a 2, right? Like it's coming from different places though. And so I think that for 6s, I think that they have an acute awareness of wanting support and guidance and wanting loyalty, wanting others to have their back. And so in that way, they're able to provide that. And so 6s definitely have this ability, to contextually be supportive and have each other's back. And I want to be careful to be so general in saying that, 6s, are team players, it depends, right? Like certain 6s like being by themselves, and most 6s like team playing. And it's really, I think, within the context, like there's many of 6s who can be by themselves, but when I ask them, they actually want their contributions to be something that is contributing to something more than themselves. There's a little different nuance from say like a 5 or sometimes a 4 or even a 9, right? So there's all these nuances. So when you say that, I think, yes, that is a 6 thing. It's just not only a 6 thing. And so the conversation is, what is the context and what kind of drives ways of being? And a lot of time we have to ask them. But I think that you're right, that it is centered around the desire and understanding for support and guidance and protection.
What I experienced was allyship, and I knew, and I still know to this day, this person has my back, like in a significant way. So when we think about a workplace environment, knowing someone is typed as a 6, that their core motivation is around security and providing that for others, it gave me a lens to be able to partner and potentially even leverage or lean in or understand where some of this team protection was coming from. It's interesting though, because I have a few more examples and they're wildly different, even though these people are also typed as 6s. So there was another 6 that I worked with who was actually on my team, and they were absolutely fantastic at collecting the details, understanding the landscape, asking really good questions, super, super responsible when it came to getting it right. We're not going to get into this, but think, 6 wing 5 potentially, and information and understanding and even documentation. What would you say to that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, again, this is what's so interesting. When we start looking at particulars, we could say, oh, yeah, there's other types that would do that too. And then when we're integrated to that, the 6 in us or the 5 in us, or sometimes even the 1 in us, we're going to be particularly attentive to details and interested in credibility. Yeah. Yes. I mean, 6s tend to be incredibly thorough, and it's driven by a desire to understand the expectations, to meet the expectations, to excellent at diligence, just being understanding what good diligence is and being able to engage that. Like we keep saying, it comes from within their desire to be confident in the credibility and the trustworthy of information, in the trustworthiness of decisions, and also individuals. And so that, I think, is where it's actually coming from.
What you're hearing a lot is you're hearing me describe behaviors, which we know could be any type. And then knowing these folks type, it helps us understand what's driving those behaviors, which is really a very powerful thing. And
I think it's everything. I think that's everything. And it's something that is so tempting as we use the Enneagram and try to understand the Enneagram, that we'll pull all these examples that are pretty much entirely behavioral. And I think that it's so important to understand that a lot of it is about how each one of us prioritize certain values. So we can contain all the values, let's say, in 9 different types. We can all share the same values, but we might prioritize those values differently. So in any given situation, any of us can activate and behave inside that value. We're just going to do it to a different degree, and we're going to prioritize them in different ways. And I think that's the context. And it really is coming from an internal, invisible place versus, the external things. And so what we do when we understand types is we can be confident that, okay, this is probably the priority. This is going to be the significance and why they're executing this way, and what they're at the deeper levels looking for and needing. And that's what's useful, but it's not actually the behaviors themselves.
Yeah, and a takeaway there is that knowing this 6 on my team had a predisposition towards having enough information to then carry that responsibility that they naturally hold really helps with change management, because you can anticipate how a 6 might respond to like a new initiative or a new project. They're going to want to gain the details, whereas you're going to have other types respond quite differently based on their core needs.
And then what also they're going to be naturally, gifted in. So if you and I were on a team, Chelsea, and we had a 6 and there were 3 of us, right? Like, even though I can do diligence, you can do diligence. Like, I don't, I think I'm pretty decent at that. You're definitely probably better than me, but a 6 is probably going to be even better than the both of us. And so and it's because they're looking for different things. They have more attention to different things. And all of these things are interesting when we're introducing multiples of people. How can we be more confident and also not just confident, but more efficient in who we're deciding to do or practice certain things? And that's kind of what I do in my life. Like, I understand the people in my life and all the people in my team in work. For me, I'm pretty integrated. Work and life are the same thing for me. And I can see others around me and they're brilliant so easily that it's like, why would I do why would I do that when this person in my life is so much better? And you and I come up with this all the time where I'm like, oh my God, I'm so glad you're here, Chelsea, because it's not that I can't do that. It's just I am not nearly as good at it as you are. And I think that's interesting. And in a weird way, it's freeing as long as there's gratitude and an ability for everyone to kind of be willing to do some of the things that nobody likes to do, right? But all this to say is that, yes, I think sixes are generally gifted with an ability to be thorough, an ability to be thoughtful in that way, to have this understanding of what due diligence means and to check and double check and triple check, and then create backup plans and right. All of these things, they tend to be just so much better at it than the rest of us.
Yeah, I also worked closely with a six. There's a lot of examples because there's a lot of sixes who was absolutely the epitome of responsible. And she also took on more of a workload, more responsibility, more upon herself to cross the T's, dot the I's. Super dutiful, but also had this expectation that other people would be that way too. And so she was really good at holding other people accountable on some level. And I think it's because she held herself accountable. Again, these are all behaviors, yes, right? But like, what's the drive there that we're noticing in that behavior?
Oh yeah, the accountability is actually, that's something that I think is, you are excellent to bring that up. I would say this is a perfect example that I can give in my life with my sixes, is that this cultural expectation and their expectation about being responsible, given the expectations that they think are there and maybe actually are there, is when we're trying to plan getting together. The sixes in my life are very thorough in like kind of setting a date and making a date. And by the way, sixes aren't the only ones, there's other types that are going to be thorough in setting date. But the difference is that there is an expectation that there's communication and there's these rules. And I feel them, as an eight, I feel that there are rules. So in the relationship with sixes in my life, I usually just say that. I sense that you holding yourself to a very high expectation when I know that things come up for everyone, and that I want you to know that I won't have any negative feelings or be irritated or whatever if you need to change your plan. So let's talk about this. Where do you really stand on? And it is consistently true that there is this kind of expectation around scheduling and around rescheduling and how all of that goes down. And so I like to understand, and honestly, it's the six in me that is asking this question and engaging it. My eight self would not care. I'd be like, well, they'll figure it out. And I don't really care if they're irritated or otherwise, because whatever, we don't need to be friends. Fine. And so the six in me is actually offering them kind of a similar courtesy of, hey, I'm going to name expectations and name preferences. And that's because I know they prefer that. And also it's not difficult for me to do. And so, hey, let's talk about it. And that you're right, that I do find that sixes hold themselves, to the very same expectation, which is something that I love. Like, I do feel that sixes are not hypocritical in that way, that they want to live into the same standards that they expect others to live into. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's releasing them from their own burden, like that they're trying to kind of bring to life in the world. It's just to say, you know what, I don't expect that of you, and please don't expect that of me. In this case, based on the work context where there needed to be a high level of accountability and really driving deliverables, and is very complex, across the entire department, super, super important projects, this person really shined in that landscape. And there's a couple other examples thinking about this same six where due diligence was of the utmost importance. And so you can start to think about mapping people to some like organic strengths that they're going to have just based on what they expect of themselves.
One thing that I want to say here, because I think it's really interesting about sixes in terms of understanding, different people on our team. Sixes actually typically report that they appreciate and even need accountability. And this is something that's interesting because I don't relate to that as an eight, and I get very irritated by accountability. It's like, if I didn't ask you, and I'm a professional and I'll let you know if I need that. And if I need that, great. And if I don't, then just leave me alone. Right. Like I'll let you know. And if I don't let you know, then I don't need it. And so, and when I have led sixes, or if I had managing sixes, it's actually an adjustment that I need to make, because most sixes actually are looking for that. They want to be held accountable and have timelines and deadlines and check-ins and lots of contact in terms of how that they are producing and how different stages of meeting different expectations. They prefer that typically. I mean, sure, there's always exceptions. And that's something for me as an 8 in my style is a lot of work for me to do, because one, I don't need it. And because I don't think that way or operate that way, it causes me a lot of internal energy to figure out what other people need. So what I've learned to do is just ask sixes. And usually they're able to develop what they need better than I am. And I just let them develop it. And then I'll do what they ask me to do. So it's like, hey, what is actually useful for you? How often do you want check-ins? What kind of check-ins that are useful for you? And then together we figure that out, and then I'll just do what they ask me to do. But this is interesting, right? Because my nature is I'm like, oof, most projects don't need, a ton of accountability unless you're dealing with people who are less mature in their professional lives. You know what I mean? Or are beginners or whatever. Like, so when you give that example, like, oh man, that's kind of is tricky. Unless there are people who actually appreciate it, and that kind of accountability frees them in a certain way and allows them to execute in better ways, which that is the conversation then.
Is it fair to say that sixes thrive within a set? Like, I already know kind of the paradox here, but fair to say that sixes thrive within a set of rules or structure when you think about like law abiding and all of that. But then also we know the paradox of that is that it could just be the opposite too. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's exactly as you say. I think that generally sixes prefer initially to have a baseline of understanding what structures and what rules exist, which gives them an initial place of security and certainty from which to operate from. And once they have that, they're able to, decide how to navigate. And I think that is interesting and different. I'm the opposite. I understand that structure and rules have its place and are very important and can actually provide more freedom. Like I intellectually understand that, but I want to start from nothing and then figure out what is useful. And sixes are generally opposite. They want to start from something and then work to, slowly reducing it. And so this is another example of like, how can we understand each other better, how we're misunderstood. It invites the conversations of really having agency in what we need and not assuming that everyone else has our same preferences, our same desires or needs.
Yeah. I've worked with a few sixes very closely in the HR space, and it's not surprising to find sixes in a place where compliance is important.
Yeah. Yep.
But also I found their gifts were really helpful in being able to look at a situation through so many different lenses. And you think about HR, maybe even an investigation, and being able to collect information and not just put together the full picture, but also to really understand how others saw it and maybe even lean into, their natural ability to integrate into other types, to relate to other people and their experience.
This is so true. I mean, a gift of all of the head types, it really is insight and foresight, which is the complexity of analyzing data. Well, one, collecting data, seeing data, and then analyzing data. It's a complex place. And insight and foresight is the gift of 5, 6, and 7s and how that comes out in different ways. But I think 6s for sure are able to generate at their best really amazing insights. And that is dependent on the quality of how they're observing, collecting, and analyzing data. And that is amazing. And the 6 in me, that's when I'm able to do that. Like, I feel like in general, I don't like details or data in a conventional social way, even though so much of my work is I am doing deep analysis and collecting all kinds of data. But generally it's with the invisible and internal and social and political, much things that aren't easily tracked or traced, right? And that's incredibly complicated. But yet it's nonetheless, it's still data information. It's just very different. But I think the 6 in me is when I'm able to have more patience and focus and depth of observing, collecting data.
I also worked really closely with a 6 in the HR space who, when we think about like leaning into or leveraging or anticipating a response or a partnership, they were less inclined to stick their neck out politically. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm starting to understand a little bit more why that could have been. And it's like, because it means breaking away from the safety of the group. How would you define that?
Well, essentially, it's about risk. So 6s are designed to manage risk and are generally risk averse. Now, this doesn't mean that 6s can't be risk takers. Of course they can. But in terms of comparatively at their baseline, generally 6s are risk averse, even if they're counterphobic. And also there's different kinds of risks, mind you. There's internal risks, there's external risks, there's relational risks, there's all different categories of risks, right? So for 6s, it's absolutely this usually a slowness to take risk because 6s are concerned about the consequences and the costs. And it's in their specialty to really understand risk. So that's the kind of baseline is, and I find that as well, that most 6s that I work with, I'm encouraging them to tap into their 7 self, 8 self, I suppose, and just go for it. That sometimes, and really what is interesting about 6s is that they are very good at assessing the upfront risk, but because they don't often trust themselves to be able to navigate the consequences, they will avoid the risk. So what 7 and 8 in us is like, we don't care about the consequences because we trust ourselves that we'll be able to fix it. So even if shit hits the fan, it's like, whatever, well, we can deal with that. We'll fix it when we get there. Right. And 6s do not have that confidence, and rightly so, because there's some things that maybe aren't fixable, or that the cost of fixing it is greater than the cost of not taking that risk, right? And so this is what I would say, the 6 in me has become better at evaluating risks, that my 8 self will just take all of the risks just because, well, I can. And that actually isn't super intelligent. It's, I need the 6 in me to actually become better at evaluating the cost and benefit of risks, and not just do risks just because I can and because that's what I'm comfortable with, and whatever, everybody else can figure it out, I'm cool. Right. That's not actually a smart strategy.
I moved to 8 in both times of stress and flourishing. And I can remember numerous times when I would walk into this 6's office and I would have this great idea to disrupt everything and try something new. And I experienced this person sometimes as a gatekeeper or a blocker because they were protecting the status quo. And part of this is about developing a capacity to understand how we can partner with them to kind of bring balance into the picture. And in this case, we're talking about balance to this 8's, like, let's risk it all. Also, have a reverence for following the rules if the risk is too great, or to think through, how can a 6 help me collect information and make a really well-educated kind of, I experience 6s to be very rational. And so, like, how can we make the right decision here? And then also keeping in mind that we might be having to overcome some of the doubt that you just mentioned.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and this is why we need each other, is that 6s, I need the 6 in me, and 6s around me I often go to help pull me off the ledge. And then 6s need me usually to say, look, I got you. Let's do this. Let's blow it up. Let's blow it up big, and I got you. And this is exactly why, partnership and understand each other is so powerful, is because we're just better together. And also we're better when we're more whole and complete in ourselves in the Enneagram terms of, being integrated into all 9 types. Makes ourselves, makes me as an 8 more precise and accurate when I'm integrated into all of the other 8 types. And this is super important. And this is what it's all about. right, is understanding each other and then integrating the best of humanity into ourselves as because we have access to that, but it's not easy, and we need each other to help us out.
Yeah, and I also wonder how we can help the six, because I've known sixes who, man, their level of credibility and almost like self-sabotage based on their crippling anxiety. How can we partner with them to help pull them out of the self-doubt and be that support, be that guidance, and also help them tap into their own inner guidance?
There is a misunderstanding around, overthinking, analysis paralysis, the paranoia, the we're all going to die, or, and the kind of deep anxiety and fear, which is just a form of fear that they're connected to. And yet those are the very things that are attached to their brilliance that allows them to have prescience, that allows them to see the future and have their insights and their foresights and to make high quality decisions. And so what's in there is deep courage. So, and that's where we generally help sixes understand is that, that they're courageous all the time and they're just not noticing it, that the amount of fears and anxiety that they experience and confusion is because of how complex their design. And it's in relation to how much information and data that they're collecting and that they're aware of. And that is a heavy weight and a big burden. And any of us, if we were doing that, would feel the identical thing. How do you manage that and navigate that? It's incredibly confusing and weighty. And especially when the majority of reality is pretty horrible. And the things that we're noticing is probably far more negative than it is positive. And it doesn't mean that the positive isn't there, but the world is a hostile, violent place. And so I think that sixes are very connected to that. You originally asked the question is how do we help sixes? And I think a lot of it is for how we help ourselves and how we help sixes in particular. It's a similar process where we first understand that our negative feelings and our, more destructive expressions are essentially tied to our brilliance. And it's first understanding that so we know where it's coming from. It's not just like random. It's not like we're just waking up in the morning and deciding to be paranoid. You know what I mean? Sixes aren't doing that. Like there's reasons. It doesn't mean make them right all the time, but to understand the source is important. And then after we help each other understand the source, and particularly we're speaking about sixes, then it's actually helping sixes evaluate, the accuracy. And also usually it's when there is some kind of analysis paralysis or whatever, it's helping them pull back to get some altitude. Usually sixes are overly looking into the details because it's what they can control and what they can test and what they can know. And so, and that's often a stress response as much as it is a part of a non-stress response where they're just doing diligence. But if they're overly doing it, it's usually from a point of stress and they've just lost altitude and they need to pull back and see the big picture. And then I'm not sure if it was a misunderstanding, but people don't know about sixes that I think is a super big strength is that sixes can take critical feedback. Most of the rest of us cannot. Twos, by the way, are the worst. Raising
my hand over here. Definitely
usually not great. Usually used to struggle. The most of us are not, but sixes actually are incredibly able to kind of objectively hear critical feedback. And it's because they're trying to understand and know, and they cannot understand and know without feedback and at least understanding other people's perspectives, whether it's true or not. And then they can evaluate that. And then they're so willing to make adjustments based on that information. And so what I love about sixes is they're actually pretty consistent in trying to get to better decisions and to perform better and willing to make adjustments that are essentially that are dependent on feedback since they already know that they can't see everything. And this is kind of the deep place of humility that I love about sixes is that they assume that they can't see everything and know everything. And so therefore they're open and looking for information, support, and guidance. And this is super amazing. We talk about the six in me, and this is what I need, because the eights, it's not our disposition. are usually overly confident. And the good thing about eights at our best, I trust myself more than anyone or anything else. And that can be really powerful and essential in certain moments, but not in all moments. That's not great in all moments. And so I need the 6 in me in order to actually be available for feedback and to have a different kind of attention to what I might be missing or what I can't see. And I do think that this is a place of a 6.
Yeah, for me, thinking about the 6 in me, I've been giving it a lot of thought, and I can easily relate to the 2. Obviously, I'm a 2, so I can easily relate to the 1, the 3. I can look across the way to integration points of 8 and 4. There's a lot of 7 in me. Like, I really feel like a lot of connectedness with 7, but 5 and 6 both. Like, I don't feel them in my day to day. I don't notice things that I'm doing that feel like sixness. And so can you unpack for us a little bit more, like how you think about the 6 in me as an 8 or so you've already shared a few insights kind of as we've been talking, but anything else that you would add to that, or maybe you can help draw it out of me. I'm eager.
Well, what I think is interesting is the same kind of process when we consider, our blind spots, and then we consider what helps fill those blind spots. And then also there's a certain kind of quality of strength or ability that we know isn't natural for us, but when we can execute that is representative. So I gave the example of, I'm naturally, I'm a risk taker. I'm not somebody who's going to take the time to really thoroughly, examine necessarily. And so when I do that, I am better. And that really is a 6 quality. So, and it would be the same for you, Chelsea, that, 2s are generally pretty thoughtful, but they're very thoughtful on a relational level and a personal level consistently. But then it's like diligence. 2s can be very diligent, but the degree of diligence and in terms of prevention, and in terms of having backup plans to backup plans, where you're really considering more long-term costs. Like this is the place of a 6. Or honestly, the most powerful place where we can locate the 6 in us is when we have courage.
Yeah.
The places where we are connected to our fears is a place of 6. So someone like me, as an 8, I'm not really deeply connected to my fears. So 1, I have to take the time and really connect to what are my fears. I mean, it's not like they're not there. We're all human. We all have them. It's just some of us aren't connected to them. So that's a place. And then when we really are able to act anyway, and we're able to overcome the obstacles that are inside our fears, that's courage. And courage, I think, is this deeper quality than we consider. It's not just external courage, although it can activate that way, but it's connected to an internal something. And this internal something is fear. So that I think is really unique. So when you are experiencing kind of the deepest form of courage is when you have the greatest amount of fear. That is something. And I would say this, that 2s actually are gifted with a large amount of courage, because courage, I think, is also really deeply located in the heart. But there's a different flavor of courage, right? There's a different space. And I think ultimately 6s are the ones that most deeply teach us about courage, because it's when it's connected to our fears when courage actually is at its peak virtue, not when we don't have the fear and when we're already ready for it, right? So does any of that land?
Yeah, I mean, 2 takeaways. One related to courage. I definitely have been conflict avoidant. And so I think there's fears that I just ignore. And I also have a lot of positivity. And so choosing to have the fear and walk through it with an outward courage versus an inward courage, that's probably maybe a distinction between 2 and 6 courage. I have other 6s in my personal life who think about situations in ways that would take so much external courage for me to execute on. And when I do, that's absolutely one way to live out the 6 in me.
Because I wanted to talk about this because I think this is really interesting and, discussion to actually think about courage more deeply. But courage, if you think about how, like, I just always so amazed at sixes, like how deeply courageous it is, even in the context of being willing to see yourself in a negative light. And this kind of goes back to the six's ability to be able to take, negative criticism. It's really a place, it kind of the deepest place, when that happens, there's this ability to look at yourself in less than perfect ways, all the way to negative ways. Like that actually requires an enormous amount of courage to see how you are potentially wrong, to see that you are even the moments where you're bad, right? Like that's the kind of courage we're talking about, right? And when we're thinking about love in terms of two-ness, right? That is kind of, where two occupies themselves in this context of courage, that we can't love very well if we're not able to see ourselves honestly and truthfully, right? Or to see others as honestly and truthfully, right? And so I think this is what six can bring to us in terms of the state of courage. That it's really pretty scary, for all of us to consider ourselves that which we don't want to be, or that which we're not trying to be, or all the ways in which we're missing the mark or whatever, right? And I think more on the deeper levels, I think some of us, like, I don't mind being bad or wrong on, the surface levels, but the things that matter to me most, right? That fucking sucks. To see the truth of it. And this is the place of courage, to be able to look at ourselves and with deep honesty. And I think this is the space of sixes. Sixes can do this better than the rest of us. And again, I'm not saying sixes are perfect at this by any stretch. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's
in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, for me as a two, pride really comes up a lot. And so that's the inability to see where I've been wrong. And so humility is a huge focus. It's a remedy for that. And I think that's where I can tap into the six ability to receive feedback. And we've talked about how they don't think they're greater or better than others or worse off than others, right? And it's this kind of grounded, centered, multifaceted view where they can take in all lenses of others, of situations, and of themselves. Another maybe call out is, I remember coining a phrase, say yes and figure it out later. And if you know me personally, you've probably heard me say that in situations, which is a bit of the essence of who I am and kind of a philosophy of life that, has some other counterbalance quotes to go alongside it. But the say yes and figure it out later, I thought of that earlier as we were talking about, barging into a six's office and going, I have this idea and it's going to be amazing. And the rest of the details, like I just have this assumption that it'll all work itself out. And so partnering with a six, or looking within myself and finding those six qualities to do the due diligence, have the risk mitigation, and have the backup plan is a really great thing to be intentionally tapping into.
Well, this reminds me too of something that I think that is missed by a lot of people who interact with sixes or have sixes in their lives, or even sixes themselves might miss this about themselves. But if sixes are doing their jobs well, meaning prevention and risk management, no one will ever know and have to interact with all the work that they've done. Sixes are doing all of this work that's fundamentally only necessary if something goes wrong. When sixes actually execute in ways where they are preventing all the things from going wrong, you will never use that. But that's the point. And so I think a lot, and this is also a metaphor, right? So that sixes, a lot of the work that they're doing can end up being very invisible, and that I think we undervalue, like just how valuable that it is. Like, I love being able to say, oh my gosh, this person did their job so well that all of the things they did are absolutely not useful. You know what I mean? Like, right now, like nothing, we don't need to do that. There's nothing. And it's like, but that's a result of doing your job so well. And that in moments when it is necessary, there's nothing that's more necessary than six's work. And when I'm speaking specifically in terms of prevention and in terms of backup plans, and well, if this goes wrong, we have this. And then if that goes wrong, we have that, right? There's nothing that's more powerful and essential when things go wrong than what sixes are doing. However, if things don't ever go wrong, then it's just, no one knows. It's just sitting there collecting, spider webs, as it should. That's awesome. That's exactly what we want.
Yeah.
So that's something that I like exposing about sixes too, is that sometimes others who are not sixes can feel weighed down, held back, like, what is this for? Like, oh my gosh, is this necessary? This is so much blah, blah, blah. And then none of it is immediately necessary, right? So it's easy to dismiss or deprioritize or all of the things, right? And yet it is super important. And the process of preparing is a valuable process in terms of how we think and how we navigate the world. It's valuable, just as valuable as, taking risks and, blowing shit up.
I think that's the perfect teaser into our next section of this 5-part episode, which is how are sixes misunderstood? And you've already started to hint at just the lack of reverence or value in what they're actually contributing. And so is there anything else you would add to the 6 in me before we wrap and then really get into the misunderstandings of the 6 in the next episode?
I think the one thing that came to mind is when we're really living as interdependent people, I think this is the place of sixes. And I think our culture and society as Americans we're in my opinion, incredibly overly independent. The other side, which is codependency. And both of those are not great and it can be destructive. And it doesn't mean that, caring about others and wanting to serve others is bad, or being moments of independence is bad. But really the sweet spot is where there's an interdependence, where it's not just me and it's not just you. It's both. And interdependence is I believe the answer in terms of our the health of our relationships. And unless we're living on an island, we all have to interact with other humans. And I think sixes they're the point where they understand and can live into this quality of interdependence. And this is another thing that we can learn from sixes that are hidden, and it is the 6 in me. And I've actually have been proud of myself because I do feel like I've gotten to a place where I'm incredibly interdependent and set up my life to be so. And I do think that this is the 6 in me. Like, I don't think this is necessarily in my natural state. And so, yeah, that would probably be the last thing I'll add.
Well,
how does that land? Does that feel right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It feels so right. It's beautiful. I look forward to reporting back on my journey towards finding more of the 6 in me and bringing it to life. So stay tuned. This was an incredibly insightful conversation. Really, really grateful. And I want to just thank all the sixes out there. Thank you for keeping us alive. Thank you for all the work that you put into all those plans, collecting cobwebs, so that when and if shit hits the fan, I mean, you said it one time, it's like, this is why we've stayed alive this long. So thank you to the sixes. We see you. In the next part, we're going to look at both how sixes can be misunderstood to validate sixes. And so, oh, wow. Yeah. People don't get it, right? As well as how to cultivate compassion for the sixes who are up to so much goodness that we experience in behaviors that, don't match goodness. So stay tuned and keep listening. If you have questions, thoughts, you want to debate something that we've shared, we absolutely invite that. So please reach out to us on LinkedIn